So without further ado, I would like to welcome Sharon Cornelissen to Politics and Prose at Union Market, celebrating the release of The Last House on the Block. The Last House on the Block takes place in Brightmoor. To meet Cornelissen's fellow residents, she introduces us to longtime residents of the neighborhood who reveal their struggles to keep a home while keeping violence, tall grass, and yes, gentrification at bay. We also meet the eclectic white newcomers of Brightmoor and learn about their real estate bargains, urban farms, and how they became the unlikely defenders of urban desolation. Today, depopulation remains more common than gentrification in poor communities. Her story offers deep insights into what it is like to live in a declining neighborhood, and through the example of Brightmoor, our author reveals why depopulation continues and helps us imagine a more inclusive and equitable city turnaround. So, Sharon Cornelissen is a sociologist and national housing expert. As director of housing at the Consumer Federation of America, she leads research and advocacy to help end our housing crisis. She received her doctorate in sociology from Princeton University and previously worked at Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies. Our author will be in conversation with Janneke Ratcliffe, vice president of the Housing and Communities Division at the Urban Institute. Over a career that spans industry, the nonprofit sector, academic research, and the federal government, her work focuses on increasing access to financial systems that foster economic security and prosperity. So please join me in welcoming our guests to Politics and Prose.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for this kind introduction, too. I'm going to start with a short reading, and then we'll have a moderated discussion, and then there's time for questions at the end. So I'm just going to dive right into to read a section from the book, and this section is a little bit about hope and how residents also related to the city and the uncertain plans of the city. So many longtime residents drew hope from fate in churches that could be rebuilt, people who could rise from hardships, and devastated neighborhoods that could rebound even against all odds. They believed in redemption, in people and places who could be saved. I found little cynicism in Brightmoor. While undoubtedly this was a big part of the reason that they were still there, few residents who remained in Brightmoor seemed to question whether their community would rise again. As Miss Alicia noted, well, we can go nowhere but up. We're done being down, so we are on our way up now. Residents not only drew hope from faiths and religious allegories to stay hopeful about Brightmoor after half a century of decline, but also shared other myths and stories as they speculated about Brightmoor's future. They believed that the city had already earmarked parts of Brightmoor for redevelopment. They just thought that the city was being secretive. So residents looked for subtle signs that gave away which areas of Brightmoor were the chosen ones. When Black Detroiter Ashley came to look at my house as a potential buyer, she was more interested in looking at estimated home values on our Zillow app than at my kitchen. What she really took as a sign, though, was the number of exotic Pokemon and training gyms to be found on Pokemon Go, which is a phone game using GPS location. She said, "Where I live, there were only rats." She thought that more exotic virtual Pokemon indicated top-down interest and thus a good investment place. When I drove around with white newcomer Jonah, he pointed out which roads were redone and which ones were not, as marking the future boundaries of where the city planned to reinvest. Jonah and Ashley were not making real estate decisions based on resurfaced roads or virtual Pokemon. Even so, these kinds of folk theories help them cope with uncertainty in the face of perceived high stakes. As the city often gave contradictory signals, changed course, or only shared knowledge with a few chosen insiders, residents had ample space for myth-making. In the depopulated city, the specter of future redevelopment always loomed somewhere just outside of view. I'll leave it there. But I hope that gave you a little bit of a preview of, the myth making in Brightmoor.
That's terrific, Sharon. So let me start by saying thank you for inviting me to talk to you about this new book at the very beginning of your book tour, and I'm so honored. I really appreciate that opportunity. And thank you for writing this book. It really opened my mind to, I'm a long time housing researcher. Ever since you graduated, in that relatively short time, you've written a number of consequential papers on topics that have really informed the policy debate and the discussion using data and facts and charts and numbers. But this is something very, very different, right? This is about, people. You have lots of great facts in the book, but you don't put them front and center. You really tell the story. And as I read it, I'm so intrigued by this experience of you like being embedded in the community with these folks. And I would love for you to talk a little bit about, what is your intention with this approach to research? What are you trying to learn or teach us about this place, about this topic, or about housing research in general? So
yeah,
take us to, it's sort of your last chapter of your book. You talk about this, but I find it, as a researcher, I find it really fascinating.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think normally when we think about research, we think about someone sitting behind a desk, maybe analyzing data on their computer, or people conduct interviews, right? So they interview people, maybe on the phone, or they come in to talk to people about their experiences. But the method of ethnography is very different. You actually go, in my case, live in a community for 3 years. And the goal of ethnography is to really understand kind of people's point of view and the conditions, that they live in and how they kind of cope with the conditions that were handed to them. So it's really a method to try to kind of put yourself next to a person and kind of see how they live their life day to day in order to understand their experience and their perceptions. It's pretty intimate, it's pretty personal to do this, but it's a way to not only describe people's voices in the book, but also, we see them, in their house, how they're coping with owning a home that may only be worth $5,000, right? And we follow people over time too. Maybe as they go from renter to homeowner and then struggle to maintain their home over time, right? So it's a method that allows you to show too, like people are mowing the grass. We're seeing them in the soup kitchen. We're seeing a reverend in the church and how he's speaking to, people in the church. So it gives us more of a glance at like what everyday life is really like in a very unusual place, right? We don't. I think when we think about cities, we may think about a neighborhood like we're in today, or we think about a city like New York City or Washington, Washington D.C., Boston. But Brightmoor was a very different place, right? By the time I moved there, the neighborhood had more fields than homes left. So yeah, what is it like to live, to be the last person who lives on your block, right? Or what is it like to deal with safety and violence in a place that has so few people left? So yes, that's what ethnography allowed me to do. Yeah.
And what the book did for me was, like, I have to admit, as I was reading it, that while I knew the facts and data about Detroit's housing market, I lacked the imagination to really understand what that meant for people's lives. And housing and community is so central to the way. I mean, I'm sure we all have a story related to home and house, but you bring us all these people's stories. It's just such compelling reading. So I really appreciated that. Well, maybe you'll talk about this a little bit as we go, but I was so curious how the people you were writing about reacted to your being in their midst.
As I was there, you mean? Yeah. I mean, I told people first of all, I show up as this, Dutch white woman in a neighborhood. So people, there was an opening. People always said, well, why are you here? What do you. So I never had to hide that, right? It was pretty obvious that I told everyone, oh, I'm here to write a book about Brightmoor. And I think a lot of people appreciated that because this is not a place that usually gets written about. This is not a place where journalists often spend time even, right? Like, I think people really appreciated that I, was there for years and even bought a house, right? By buying a house, I showed I was invested in its place alongside them. And so, I think people definitely and I was sort of a fun distraction, kind of like, oh, this is different. Like a lot of people had a very small world in this neighborhood. Like they would never go downtown, right? One time in the book, I take Harold, who's a white long timer. I take him downtown because he needs to talk to the city in order to try to buy his house that was lost for tax foreclosure. And he's like, oh, I wonder what the new stadium is like, which had been there for 5 years, right? Like he would never go downtown. And by bus, it would take 1 hour and 20 minutes at least to get downtown, right? This is a neighborhood that's far away from downtown Detroit. So I think, I hoped that I opened people's world up a little bit too, just as they opened my world by me being able to be there. Yeah.
It's amazing. It's beautiful. Okay, so take us to Brightmoor. Your neighbors, your house. Can you tell a little bit about the house, how much you paid for it, and what it was like, and how that went, and just give us a little bit of a without telling us the endings or this.
Yeah. Well, because the book takes place over years, so you kind of see the neighborhood change, and the people, they go through different experiences. So, So I bought this was a very unconventional housing market. So I lived there from 2015 to 2018. And at the time, the city of Detroit was at the height of its tax foreclosure crisis. So a lot of Detroiters were losing homes due to falling behind on their taxes, and the city putting really heavy fines and fees on back-owed taxes. So at the time, as Detroiters were losing their homes, the county would repossess them and then auction them off online, starting at $500. So this is where the sort of infamous $500 Detroit home came from. So imagine being in a neighborhood where every year more homes, people lose homes, and they're being put on the market starting at $500. So this absolutely collapsed the housing market in this neighborhood. So I bought my house for $7,000. But that price, of course, was conditional on all the losses that were happening around it, right? My house was not a house that a Detroiter had lost. However, it was part of that whole landscape of loss.
You tried intentionally to avoid the auction route and
yes.
the taking advantage of.
Yeah, that didn't. I didn't want to be part of that. So how do you buy a $7,000 house, right? Okay. We both work in housing, but none of the conventional people that are part of housing market, none of the sort of formal institutions that normally support housing were there, right? So no realtors. In my house, when I bought my house, there was no realtor, there was no attorney, no inspector, no lender, right? It was a cash transaction. Like I had to have the cash. Me and the seller, we kind of drove through a credit union together, and I wrote a check for $7,000, and I typed out the deed. Like I did a quit claim deed, right? So I kind of typed out the deed myself. I emailed a befriended attorney to kind of look at it. Like, is this okay? She was like, yes, that's fine. So I don't know if people have bought a house here, but in my closing, I only had one piece of paper in my closing paperwork. One piece of paper. And that was it. And then, I had to go downtown to the city myself to record it, right? Normally your closing company does that for you. And that was it, right? So very, very different situation. But it's, we kind of laugh about it, but it becomes very difficult for people to benefit from home ownership under those conditions, right? Because you cannot get a mortgage, you cannot get a loan. If your roof starts leaking, you have no home equity, right? So your roof starting to leak, that may be the end of your home ownership, right? That may be the end of that. So home ownership became very precarious under those conditions. And a lot of people, we're thinking about home ownership as this way of building wealth and kind of passing it on to the next generation. But under these conditions, home ownership was draining wealth, right? Like it didn't build up to anything.
So maybe you could just give us a taste of one of the homeowners, the longtime residents who sticks around for this, or who's living there now, under such circumstances.
Yeah. One of the homeowners that I was lucky to meet is called Lakeisha in the book, and she is one of the homeowners who owns the last house on the block. So it actually took me a while to meet her because she had a pit bull kind of tied up to the porch so no one could like approach. But I was like, oh my God, I really want to meet that homeowner specifically. Like, I'm just so curious about their experience. So one day, mowing the grass is a big theme in the book too, because this neighborhood has more grass than homes. So one day I was driving around and someone was mowing the grass. And I'm like, oh, I actually know this guy. This is Harold. So through him, I met Lakeisha, and she used to be a renter in this last house on the block. But her landlord was kind of a slumlord and had been collecting rent, but not been paying his taxes. So he lost the home, even though she had been paying rent. But she was able to buy the house on auction and become a homeowner for the first time. So she was very proud. This was a very important part of her kind of middle of like her identity, to be a homeowner in her neighborhood, right? Like the neighborhood that she called her own. So that's just one of the stories. And, you know, there's a lot more, like what Janneke was saying, I don't want to give away, but we're meeting a lot. She stays with us for a lot longer throughout the book, and we learn what happens with her and with her home in the end. Yeah.
And again, no spoiler alerts, but I heard you just went back to really officially launch the book last week. So, you know, there's even more to learn and see. So that's the long-term residents. But there were some other characters in the book, some other, I guess, characters. They're real people. Yeah. Are they gentrifiers? I mean, you know, so we can talk about gentrification a bit, because I think it's very curious to me, like, it seems like it creates a sort of a good guy, bad guy scenario, but it's a lot more complicated than that, right, in the case of Brightmoor. So, yeah, give us a glimpse of those folks.
So Brightmoor had been a neighborhood that had been losing population for decades, right? So for 7 decades, had been losing population. So, but starting in 2006, this curious thing happened where a group of like around 35 households of white newcomers started to move into Brightmoor, coming from all over the United States, not just from Michigan. And they bought these houses, starting at $500 that Detroiters had lost.
I love the people who Googled, it's like randomly put in a Google search.
Yes. Many of them found Brightmoor through Google, right? Like, one Peter and Lucy were like a young couple in their mid-20s who'd sort of traveled all over the United States. They'd lived in a trailer on a driveway in Portland for a while, right before they moved to Brightmoor. And when I asked Peter how they found Brightmoor, he said, well, I Googled the best place to live in the United States. And, that's how I found Brightmoor. But they did Google, and they kind of looked for urban farming, community, cheap lands, right? At the time, Detroit was in the news a lot. So these white newcomers came with a very specific vision for Brightmoor. It's kind of, that's sort of the gentrification dynamic there too. They didn't come for Brightmoor for what it was, but what they thought its potential could be as they saw it, right? So it's kind of this sort of empty slating, like neighborhood. Brightmoor was not empty, right? There's a lot of stories there that I tell in the book too. But they came in with this idea of like, oh my God, I can buy a house for $500 and I can buy land around it and I can own my urban farm. That's what I wanna do. So they came, so Peter and Lucy in particular, they built like a tiny house themselves, and they just kind of plopped it down on land that, they didn't own. But like, a Singapore-based LLC kind of owned that land, so that they weren't gonna show up. So they just plopped down their tiny house at the end of a dead-end street, like next to the abandoned Hubert School building that had been closed for over a decade. What they didn't know was that this block was known for kind of prostitution and drug dealing. So they kind of came with this bucolic vision of their farm, but they landed in the middle of something that a lot of residents kind of knew as sort of a place to go for prostitution. So that's just one kind of conflict, but that happens again and again, right? As the white newcomers kind of came in with their vision, but sort of conflicted with kind of what was already happening in the neighborhood. Yeah.
Yeah, I like some of the terms you gave it really, I think, display it well. One was, you talked about precarious real estate already among the long-timers or the existing residents. And then you say the newcomers have they see the bucolic in the blight. Like they look at what some people see as blight and they see it as a dream come true, right? They see what the fields and the long, tall grass could be. So I also like the concept of the DIY gentrifier. They were sort of performing gentrification, trying to make their vision of what it could be come to life.
Yeah. There's kind of this like gentrification. Sometimes there's this idea that purely through kind of being a group of white people and kind of purely through being in the neighborhood, like you can already change it, right? This idea of like, oh, by being here, we can kind of force gentrification almost. And one example of do-it-yourself gentrification that I give in the book was that they decided to organize a farmers market on Venkel Avenue, which is kind of the main corridor in the book. And the farmers market was a money-losing kind of operation. Not a lot of people like showed up, and the farmers market was was in front of an abandoned fish fry restaurants. There were vacant lots everywhere, and it was across from a gas station that was an active drug market at the time, right? So a lot of residents were like, I'm not going to go to that farmer's market. I don't want to be right in front of this drug market. But they thought that by kind of staging the farmer's market year after year, they could eventually make it a success. They thought they could make Brightmoor a place where a farmer's market could happen, right? But as I describe in the book, that it didn't.
Don't tell. But
no spoiler.
I also feel like there was a sense of which, as there was a farmer's market in Brightmoor, they were making it, so they could tell themselves they were in that situation that they actually imagined for the place.
That's right. That's right.
There's a couple themes that. Maybe I'll just throw both of them out there, and you can pick one or both if you kind of want to offer anything about it. They're both really hard and big, so take your pick. Okay. One is the intractable role of racism in in creating Brightmoor in the first place. And then the other thing that I thought that I just, and I'm only asking both questions at once because we've limited time, so you have your pick. But the role of the city and the policy options, maybe the policy mistakes they made or the policy options they had that could have been done better. So like I say, what would you like to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I show in the introduction, I give a little bit more grounding, right? Because this is not just in Detroit. Like, there's a lot of depopulated cities out there. Someone else did a study kind of looking at sort of the trajectories of poor neighborhoods in the United States, and twice as many neighborhoods lost population between 1990 and 2010 than gained population, right? So we often talk about gentrification, but actually depopulation is very common too, right? And it remains in cities, it remains a predominantly Black experience, right? So if we're thinking about racial inequality, we should also talk about depopulation and how that's kind of how neighborhood trajectories shape people's opportunities too. I lay out a lot of the history of Detroit is a history of racism in many ways, right? And the history of deindustrialization, but white flight. The crack epidemic kind of coming into Detroit, particularly in neighborhoods like this. But also kind of more recent. I mean, the subprime mortgage crisis very much hit Brightmoor, and that happened between 2000 and 2010. So that's fairly recent, right? So, the tax foreclosure crisis. NAACP sued the county because the tax foreclosure system had a racially disparate impact on Detroiters, right? And they won that case, right? We were part of that. Brightmoor was part of that too. So there's these moments one after the other that really shape the reality that we find today in Brightmoor. It wasn't like one moment, or it wasn't just like the auto industry leaving. And some of these moments are fairly recent too, right? So, I think it's also a lesson that, decline is alive and well in some ways, and it's here to stay. And this happened to Detroit, but it doesn't mean that it cannot happen to other places too, right? I think I've started to think more about, climate change, for example, And, it was in Brightmoor, it was really difficult to get homeowners insurance. Like even I struggled. I had to call a bunch of places, to get homeowners insurance. And it was fairly expensive. And so a lot of people did not have homeowners insurance, right? Like it was impossible to get a mortgage. Well, that reality is going to hit, certain coastal areas and, areas affected by climate change. So if, people, in Florida, they may want to read this book too, right? To kind of understand, how that trajectory of decline can happen once, lenders retract or, home insurance companies don't want to do business there anymore, right? So decline is not just something from the past, but it's something that is very much alive and still unfolding itself. And that may be the future for some new places too.
Well, like name some of the places where you see the lessons or the Detroit. I mean, we think of Detroit, it's the poster child for this story, right?
Yeah.
And maybe the scope, the scale of loss of community, of loss of ways of life, of loss of wealth, of real trauma, right? As particularly for people who lived through as the decay said, and you talk a lot about the trauma and the violence that they experienced and how that colored. So we all sort of have this picture of Detroit, but you're saying there's more and more places facing this question of depopulation. So what are some other kind of communities where you see this happening?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole map in the book with other cities, but I went down to Memphis not too long ago, and if you drive around there, very similar like neighborhoods as I saw in Detroit. Baltimore is not too far from here. There's a lot of communities still that struggle with a similar, types of decline. A lot of small cities. Trenton, Fall River in Massachusetts, Birmingham, Flint in Michigan, right? Cleveland. Like there's definitely. But many of the cities that are most impacted by this continue to be kind of mid-sized to small cities. So we just don't hear as much about them, right? They don't capture the news cycle as much, but it's very real for people that live in those places. Yes, I think there's lessons here for a lot of these kind of smaller cities too.
Because you and I, we both talk a lot about the housing crisis, and that typically gets painted as one. It feels a little more like the DC story, right? Where there's so many people that want to live there. There's not enough houses. There's gentrification. It's not failing. It's actually happening. Yeah. And there's displacement. It's sort of the opposite of the depopulation story. So I think this book is really And I also think this is happening not just in places that you name, but like in bigger cities where there's sections and parts of those cities that are...
Chicago, yeah.
That's right. So, so again, maybe a bit of a... How do you square that with the housing supply crisis as we typically think about it?
Yes, I was in Eastern Kentucky. So in my current job, I'm writing new reports, doing new research. And in October, I had a chance to go to Eastern Kentucky for 10 days to look at the housing crisis there and what it looked like. And, my experience in Detroit, don't tell the people in Eastern Kentucky because I don't think they like the comparison. But my experience in Detroit, actually helped me a lot to kind of understand, Eastern Kentucky also has a lot of older housing stock. People live in terrible conditions, right? There's a lot of homeowners, but what does that look like, right? Like people may live in flood-damaged homes and trailers, may not have adequate plumbing or heating, definitely no air conditioning, right? So kind of the sort of deteriorating housing stock is very much part of our housing crisis too. And, there's not much in my neighborhood, nothing was built over the last 2 decades at least. Eastern Kentucky, kind of similar, right? Very few new homes being built. So in order to tackle the crisis, we also have to preserve the housing stock that we have and offer people ways to make their homes more resilient and to upgrade them. And I think this is true, both in Eastern Kentucky and in these kind of depopulated cities. And it is very much part of our housing crisis too. I do see that we're talking more here at the national level. We're starting to talk more about solutions to that problem too, right? So I think in this Congress, there's been more attention to small dollar mortgages, right? The fact that it's impossible or very hard to get mortgages for homes valued below around $150,000. and like more attention to upgrading our housing stock, right? Like the Neighborhood Home Investment Act, where we are thinking about investing more in upgrading our housing stock and giving tax breaks for investors that upgrade homes and then sell them to homeowners, right? So I think I think we're seeing more of that, and the book is kind of part of that movement too, I think, yeah.
And it's also making us understand that home ownership in and of itself is not unequivocally good. It benefits some groups of people, but it doesn't have that same kind of well-being generation for whole other groups of people.
Yeah, and I think it's hard. I think when we talk about housing, it's so often industry groups, and they would never say, oh, they would always say, oh, home ownership is the best thing ever. It's good for everyone. Like everyone should be a homeowner, right? But like the dream of home ownership did not deliver for these people, right? Like actually it kind of turned into a nightmare for some people. And people did get some housing stability. They did get the sort of the pride of home ownership, but they also got a lot of stress that came with it. And they, some of them, including that in the book, like lost their homes, right? And they had to go through that trauma too. So yes, home ownership doesn't always deliver. I think it's hard to say that right now because we've been in this incredible like housing bubble and a home appreciation bubble, but the housing market is incredibly cyclical too. So it kind of comes and goes, right? So some people went through both a mortgage foreclosure and then later the tax foreclosure, right? So yes.
Well, I noticed while you're talking that you keep using the words we. We were there, we did that, so I love that. I can see that the community is still very much with you and, you're living with it still. And so I recommend the book for just that reason, to really get to know and feel connection to the folks in the community that you wrote about. So I think we have some time for audience Q&A. And I see you got to wait for the mic to come to you so that it can all be captured.
Hi, Sharon. I'm Michael DeLong, one of Sharon's associates at CFA. So in the neighborhood, was insurance important to folks, and did it have an effect? Or were they able to get any sort of protection for their homes, or was it basically like the companies won't insure you, so if there's a fallen tree or some sort of damage, you're completely out of luck?
Well, Michael and I wrote a report together about uninsured homeowners. So that's where the question is coming from. No, a lot of people were uninsured. Like, as I said, even when I bought the house, the existing homeowners, they had insurance coverage. So I called that insurance broker, and then he was like, no, I don't want to sell. I don't want to sell to you. So I had to so he referred me to sort of a friend of his, someone who only did business in the city of Detroit, kind of like inferior kind of product, which would be very expensive for very little coverage. So I had to call a lot of different companies to actually find kind of ordinary coverage for myself. But most people could not afford, the addition. I think it was like $3,000 a year for a $7,000 house, right? That doesn't really make sense. The only reason I did it is because I really wanted to make sure that I didn't leave that I could sort of leave like a whole house when I left, right? So I have a responsibility as an ethnographer to make sure that I pass on this house better than I found it to the next homeowner. So that's why I was like, no, I need to buy insurance to ensure that, basically, yeah.
But it's a $3,000 a year on a $7,000 house. But also, for example, if you had your roof damaged, it's like a $10,000 roof on a $7,000 house. So I can see, the quandary. Yeah.
No, for sure. And I mean, this is the part of the problem. This is a part of the problem, right? This is why people could lose houses over a leaking roof. Yeah.
One other thing I noticed in the book, it strikes me that you mentioned basement flooding in these communities, and so that happened a lot, and part of it seemed to be attributed to development decisions that the city had made in other neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So through no fault of theirs, only people moved into a climate risky neighborhood. But neighborhoods can become more climate exposed because of development being done in other places.
No, absolutely. Like the Rouge River ran through Brightmoor, but in the upriver, there had been a lot more development, suburban developments, where when white flight happened, a lot of people moved into the suburbs. So the suburbs became more and more built up, but that meant that there was less permeable surface, right? So more kind of water flood into the Rouge River, starting to flood Detroit, right, and including Brightmoor, right. So there is this close connection between the suburbs and the city. But sort of ongoing denial, right? Like, there was no kind of, in Detroit, the relationship between the suburbs and the city is still terrible, right? There's not kind of, there was a bus that would go from Brightmoor to downtown, but it would stop like right at the border of Brightmoor. It would go no further, right? So if you want to go to the jobs, which are mostly in the suburbs, like your Detroit bus is not going to get you there, right? You'd have to kind of walk a little bit, take a different bus into the suburbs, right? So, but yes, which is a different issue, but for sure, yeah.
It all fits together.
So thank you for writing the book. It's it's really drawing me in. So as you look back on day one where you made the purchase, you actually had your keys, and as you navigated through every kind of obstacle that you faced, which one was the biggest like head turner, like, oh my God?
So that's a great question. One thing that was pretty shocking to me was that, so as a homeowner, I had to go to the water department in Detroit to connect my water, I guess, in my name. So I had to go to the physical water department. And at the time, there were a lot of water shutoffs happening in Detroit. So the water department would, if you're $50 behind on your water bill, they would shut off your water. So families would live, children, they wouldn't go to school because there was no water to wash their clothes with, right? So they would feel embarrassed, they wouldn't go to school. So I showed up at the water department on the west side of Detroit and had to wait 5 hours in line outside. It's just me and, Detroiters that have their water shut off. So that was really confronting because I was there because I had purchased a house, right? But these people are there because they don't have water in their house anymore and they have to wait in line for 5 hours to get water for their families again. So that was, a lot of, becoming a homeowner, like it put me in all these places, right? Sort of like, even I write in the book, like I realized, I realized I needed to write about grass, partly because I became responsible for my own grass, and like my neighbors were very like keen on me maintaining my lawn, which is like seems so suburban, right? 2 houses down, there was like a burned down house on my block, but then my neighbors, they're like really watching me to make sure I like maintain my lawn, right? I'm like, I need to write about this, right? So there's all these experiences. I had a neighbor with a pit bull, and every time I would be in my garden, she would like let her pit bull out, and then I realized, oh, she's doing this to help me, to like protect me, basically, right? So all these moments, partly by really living there, that I kind of learned more about the community. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to reading the book. I'm thinking like I have spent all of my adult life in Boston, Austin, and now DC. And so when I think about gentrification, like my experiences with that are very specific. And so, Janneke may have alluded to this kind of this difference or conflict when you asked about the housing crisis. But if I'm asking about just the whole analytical premise of the book, stop me. But my question is like, how can gentrification possibly fail in this sort of environment? Like what like systems or structures were absent in Brightmoor that you see in these other places where it really flourishes?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and it gets at the heart of kind of things that I'm kind of unpacking in the book too, right? Through the stories. Gentrification happens in waves. first of all, right? So there's kind of different generations of newcomers that move in, and oftentimes the first generation are sort of artists and students. They may be culturally middle class or upwardly mobile, but they don't have a lot of money themselves. So we saw that first generation, but then kind of newer generations never followed, right? There wasn't buy-in. I mean, Black working class or middle class Detroiters, they weren't drawn to this neighborhood, right? They didn't want to live like kind of as the last house on the block, in between farms, right? There wasn't broader buy-in into this idea. And then another key thing that was absent is that both developers and the city didn't buy into this idea at all. So the city didn't invest. So a lot of people had, a lot of the white newcomers had goats, some had sheep, chickens, ducks, peas, but that was all illegal. Like that was not, the city didn't actually pass a law about this until last year. So now you can have ducks and chickens and bees in the city. But a lot of the things that urban farmers were doing was actually illegal. So that's the extent to which the city didn't buy in. And then there wasn't this kind of commodification of like the idea of the Brightmoor farmhouse. We're in Union Market, right? There's sort of like this whole like kind of authentic urban space became kind of commodified by developers, right? As sort of, oh my God, this is like an authentic urban community. The warehouse district. People didn't commodify. I mean, these were the houses, right? Like they didn't commodify this idea of like, like a 1940s, like kind of small bungalow that was like, an authentic farmhouse, right? That didn't happen. So yeah, great question.
Yeah, there was like a little moment of Detroit cool coming up, right? There was maybe a tiny bit of momentum, but it.
Yeah, like before the pandemic, there was more of that momentum. But and there's definitely, I was in Detroit last week. There's definitely that, top-down development, city buying in. Ford's kind of moving in. I was like in Corktown, for example, which is a neighborhood right outside of downtown. When I lived there, like the big Michigan train station was abandoned. Now, I was there and it was like a gala event happening in the train station. Very different, but it was because of big developers and the city kind of coming in to kind of collide, stand behind gentrification, basically, right? So the movement of people into a neighborhood is not sufficient in itself. It's really these other forces that need to happen to make a gentrification. Yeah.
And we talked about this some, so it is a great question. Gentrification is not just a magic, organic process, I think is a really big takeaway from that experience.
No, that's a good way of putting it.
And the other tricky thing is like, what do you want? Do we want gentrification there? It's like, really, what is the right answer? Yeah, because that has always got its displacement. The residents that you got to know so well would also be displaced by gentrification, so.
Yeah, it wouldn't help them, right? It wouldn't help them, yeah. Yeah.
I'll just say I'm from Detroit. I still think it's cool.
I see the sweatshirt, yes.
Yeah. From actual Detroit, from in the city. I'm really curious from a policy standpoint what your thoughts are. You talked about a couple of different challenges, from insurance, being the thing that could displace you, through to slumlords. And also the train station was there because of the slumlord, the very famous slumlord. What are some of the priority policies that you would think could help keep residents in Brightmoor while not necessarily discouraging investment?
Yeah. I think, ongoing reform to the tax foreclosure system. There's been a lot of good reform already in the years since I lived in Brightmoor. For example, there used to be this idea, like you could get a poverty exemption if you make below a certain income. But it was so bureaucratic that it was impossible to get, right? So it's like, we have this program, but then like there was like a window of 10 days that you needed to get the form, and you needed to like, bring the form downtown, right? So it was very, very hard to get. So that is, they had to sue over this. That's reformed, but I think more reforms could be made there. Home repair grants and investments. There's a lot of older homeowners in Detroit. And people, don't necessarily have the equity or the savings or access to affordable loans to maintain their homes, right? So really investing in the housing stock that's there, and the homeowners and the communities that are there, I think is a key part of that as well. And I think, I mean, what I also write in the book is just like better communication between the city and the residents, right? Bringing the city more into the neighborhoods and where people are at and communicating with people there. And there's a lot of fancy plans that have been made for Detroit over the years, like really beautifully designed, you know, Detroit future city, like maps, whatever. but let's actually do it, right? Let's put that to work, and communicate to residents ongoingly what your plans are, so people don't have to kind of speculate or, you know, feel like things are being done to their neighborhood and they're not being involved in that. I think that's another key thing that we have Detroit elected a new mayor, Mary Sheffield. So she has 12 years of experience on city council, and she did introduce a number of bills around tax foreclosure prevention as well. So I'm fairly hopeful that will be a fresh kind of energy with a lot of good policy ideas too. Yeah, but thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It's kind of a single question, and two, you've talked a lot. Now, I'm born and raised Detroiter myself, so a lot about both the separation between the city and the suburbs, but it's also, as you've noted, a separation between the city and the neighborhoods. And we've alluded to small cities, medium-sized cities. Well, Detroit physically is not a small city. It's a very large city. And so the first question would be, how did you see that just the sheer size lead to the city picking kind of winners and losers in its planning and development for neighborhood? And the second, did you discuss it all with the neighbors? How did they feel about hearing this? Detroit's back, it's such a vibe, which was true for about like 6 square miles of the 140 or so.
Yeah. 139 square miles. I think the city of San Francisco, Boston, and Manhattan all fit within the city of Detroit. So it's truly massive, and that sort of shaped the scale of the problem too, right? For the city to kind of having to choose, as you said, pick winners and losers of where they're going to direct the little money that they got. Sorry, what was the second part of your question?
About the Brightmoor residents, especially how they even identify as Detroiters, because they kept having to hear, it's on the LCA and everything. This sort of this opposition to downtown was very alive and well. However, you know, there was hope because of the people next to the forts that have land next to the train station got like $100,000, right, or more. You know, maybe the time will be there for us next. And I talk in the book too about kind of resident speculators or resident investors. So you know, some people like wanted to be part. They're like, well, the neighborhood has gone down for so many decades, and there's white newcomers moving in now. We better buy some houses and land ourselves, right? We want to be there when the neighborhood turns around. But that in itself became difficult for them to maintain, right? People, because, you know, okay, well, how long is it going to be till the neighborhood turns around? And you still have to maintain that sort of extra house that you bought down the block, and you have to pay taxes on it. And, you know, a tree may fall on the roof, and then you have to deal with that. So kind of some residents became very stretched as they are kind of waiting for the turnaround to happen. So it became part of the sort of, the experience even of home ownership or kind of land speculation, even by residents too. But yeah, thank you. Yeah.
So a lot of the conversation so far has been about neighborhood change, and I'm curious about how the houses structured, or how the houses functioned as houses too. So I'm curious about longtime residents who are attached to their house. They just want to stay in their home and live in it. Were there ways that what was happening in the neighborhood limited their ability to stay in their house or affected their experience with their house?
You mean like broader neighborhood events, or like? I
guess I was thinking through quality of city services, stuff like that, or could longtime residents who just wanted to stay in their house, were they able to, and the houses pretty much functioned as houses the way that they would expect them to?
Yeah, I mean, I think the physical reality of the house
like was what most challenging for people. But you know, it was a little overwhelming sometimes for them to live in a place like this, right? Because your house is slowly falling apart. Your house may have been built in the 40s, it was always kind of a lower income neighborhood. So a lot of the housing stock was kind of lower quality. It was never built to last this long. So your house is constantly kind of falling apart. You know, your streets, like there may be a vacant house across from you. Like what's happening with the vacant house, right? Who is in there? Who is not in there? You know, sometimes groups would board up homes, but then the boards would disappear, right? So grass would grow tall on your block because the city would maintain the land that it owned. So that was pretty overwhelming for people. Schools were very low quality. You know, I mean, when I lived there, another school, like a charter school, closed. I think they found like molds in the school building, and then they never reopened. So it's sort of a lot of things are working against you. I mean, the city. I mean, people. You know, I write about like a city that doesn't seem to care. People, for various reasons, didn't think that they could rely on 911 or the police showing up or the police being there for them, right? So then you're kind of on your own, right? You're like, well, I have a gun, or, oh, I have my pit bull, or the white newcomers, they set up kind of a text alert group with the idea that if something happened, you would text the group first, and then your neighbors would show up, and then you may call 911 next. But there wasn't this, like, the idea that, like, city services are not really there for us. One of the women I lived with, she was allergic to bee stings. So when I lived there, she showed me her EpiPen and she gave me instructions. She's like, don't call 911, just drive me to the suburban hospital immediately, right? So like it becomes much harder to like live in a place like that because you have to deal with the sort of trajectory of decline of your neighborhood too. And and it was both sort of these everyday things, but then also the stress of that. And I write about that too, like the stress of, well, oh, my son is going to like a medical appointment, but I'm worried about him. So I'm relieved when he's back home again, right? So for some residents, it just meant that they were like staying inside a lot and that they're not really, they're just in their home, right? They're not really engaging with the community. People had like different ways of coping with that stress. Right?
So, and it strikes me, I mean, it's at every level, right? The houses themselves, some of them lacked like central HVAC, like heat and air conditioning. There probably were cases where people had to get power somehow to their properties, right, if they weren't. And then the flooding basements. And also what really struck me as when you were talking about the infrastructure as crazy is that people were mowing their lawns, they were mowing their blocks. But if somebody didn't mow the lawn, but the city was not taking care of its lots, but it would fine residents for not taking care of theirs.
Yeah, there's a lot of irony, right? That the city was handing out blight tickets, including to small business owners that still were on Venkel Street, the few that were still there, while it was always in violation of its own blight policy, right? They owned, at some point the city owned half of all property in Brightmoor. Right, so a lot of, I mean, this house on this is owned by the city, right? That's the for sale sign is from the city, right? So, the city didn't really help in that experience, yeah.
Well, I'll just, good.
It sounds like there was a huge disjunction between what existed as a formal, like, legal matter, the laws, and what were actually illegal, and what existed as social realities and like informal norms that filled the vacuum of what authorities could or could not provide. I found it striking that you started with this vignette of faith and folk stories that people sort of came up with from the ground up. And what sounded like white gentrifiers were importing like a frontier mentality and all that wasn't being supplied by the city. I'm curious because you mentioned going to other places and seeing similarities or maybe sort of recurring themes, whether there were sort of like folk norms replicated in other places or whether personalities specific to Brightmoor really sort of like gave voice to like that particular place.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one thing that's very specific about Detroit is and we have some Detroiters here to attest to this, is this kind of like do-it-yourself mentality. You know, people are not content to wait for the federal government or for the state or for the city to do something about it. You know, they're like, oh, no one is demolishing this house. I'll just rent a truck and we'll try to demolish it ourselves, right? Or like, oh, no one is, this is a city house, but the city is not doing anything. We'll just board it up and we'll do something. So this sort of kind of do-it-yourself mentality was very culturally specific, I think, to Detroit. This like, we can do it and we'll just do it ourselves. And I think that shaped a lot of the, you know, the activities that we kind of see in the book, and the sort of the way that people even coped with, you know, the police never showing up. So, you know, so I think that was very specific there. I mean, a thing that I've seen, like in other places, that, you know, is the sort of that the informality of the housing market and what that does to a housing market, right? Like when I was in Eastern Kentucky, there was like a Facebook group where you could like sell your house on, right? You know, or someone, you know, I spoke to a lawyer who worked at a legal aid clinic who had sort of recently moved into the community. So when he was buying a house, I mean, he had you know, more money, but it was still a struggle for him to find a house for sale even, because he said it's all word of mouth. You know, it's kind of like, oh, my cousin has a house. Oh, here's a picture on my phone, like a vague picture of this house, right? Or you kind of have to drive by. And it's the same in Brightmoor. Like you'd have to talk to people to kind of know which houses were for sale. Partly at the time, at least, people didn't want to put a for sale sign on their house because that may show that the house is vacant. And they didn't want it to become a target of scrapping in particular. Scrapping was like, I described the scrap yard was conveniently located right into the neighborhood. So you can imagine what that does, right, to the housing stock, or even schools, right? The vacant schools, like they would get burned multiple times, partly as it was a way to kind of access the metal that was in the walls. So yes, I think that is more general and that is replicated elsewhere. Even though we may, if we're just looking at the data, like Janneke was saying, like we may never see that. Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you again. Sharon is so smart and so bright and has command of all the data and the policy language, but you are tireless in fighting for bettering people's lives through the housing lens. And I commend your speaking up with the voices for the folks in Detroit. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Janneke. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.